Okay, so let's go back to what we are here for. Let's talk about Natasha Hausdorff. Let's finish that video that she was that we were looking at the other day, shall we? So what we were doing is we were looking at Natasha Hausdorff's testimony before the House of Commons here in the United Kingdom, and fact checking what she was saying with some my views on international law. So okay, so let's do part 2 of fact checking Natasha Hausdorff, shall we? Let's start the video. I think we were at minute 20, so let me just put it here.
That you've answered there. What makes UN, the UN
Oh wait,
Security
a
Council,
little
the
bit
ICC?
earlier.
Stop
Hey,
there.
this is where I stop.
Questions for you. Addison.
Thank you. So I think it's just coming on to the crux of the question that you've answered there. What makes UN, the UN Security Council, the ICC, the ICJ, all the esteemed lawyers there in their advisory positions, every British government since 1967, pretty much every international legal authority, they've all stated that the settlements in the occupied territories are legal, and yet your position is different. What makes you better than all of these other lawyers that we've heard from who perhaps, in your view, don't understand real international law?
I love the
what makes
real.
why should we hear your position as different and unique to theirs?
I've never suggested that I'm in any way better, but until and unless I am presented with an argument that makes it clear that this is the wrong application of international law, as opposed to what the UN and what these international courts and tribunals have consistently done, with some exceptions, I'm minded to say. There was the dissent that I mentioned from Sebutinde. In relation to the ICC, in fact, in 2021, there was also a very powerful dissent by Judge Kovacs. So I would...
Can I intervene here? Natasha, do you agree then that the occupations are not legal?
She doesn't believe that the occupation
is not legal. Yes or no?
No, it's not a yes or no, because one cannot annex what is one's own sovereign territory. So the term annexation is misplaced here. Likewise, the term occupation, because when Israel recovered that territory... Let me give you a parallel example, which I know members of the committee will be familiar with. Russia has occupied Crimea from Ukraine. Why? Because Ukraine's borders were settled by Uti Possidetis Juris. If Ukraine were to recover Crimea from Russia, in the same way that Israel recovered the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and East Jerusalem from Jordan.
That's assuming that Israel owns that piece of land to start off with.
Well, yes, but I'm saying the same rules have to apply.
Can I come on to a different question, Natasha?
May I just finish the answer?
And I've got a different question.
The same rules have to apply.
Quite limited on time. I'm so sorry.
So this comparison to Russia is very weird, right? Because the disassembling of the Soviet Union is actually completely different from the birth of Israel. Like, the Soviet Union was a union. It was the amalgamation of different countries, different Soviets, into the USSR. So when the USSR was divided, like collapsed and divided, yes, the previous borders that were like the internal borders of the USSR were used to determine what were going to be the borders of the new countries, right? Because we were dealing with this sort of like entity that was disassembling itself from its parts, whereas that's not what happened in Israel-Palestine. If Israel had been the result of the partition plan, and so it were complying with the partition plan's borders, then you would follow those borders. But when Israel seceded from Palestine, it was not disassembling any kind of union. It was winning territory militarily from Palestine. Like the war of Israel's war of independence was a war to gain territory through military means. So they were not like disassembling a union in that same way. They were gaining territory through military means. So the example is bizarre. Like, the comparison is bizarre. Like, Israel is not Ukraine. Israel is Russia. Israel is the aggressor against the Palestinian state in this case. So the comparison is really bizarre. Simply put, when Israel declared independence, it was not enforcing any kind of colonial borders. It was trying to win territory that it was seceding from the state of Palestine. Israel was not the independentist movement of Palestine. If it had been, then the war would not have happened in the way it happened, because then everyone would have been in agreement. Like the Arab states attacked Israel because their position was there should not be two states, there should be one single state, it should be called Palestine, and it should be national, plurinational, or whatever, like with like both rights for Jewish people and Palestinians and Arab Palestinians. And so, if what Israel would have been, if it had been representing that independentist movement of Palestine, then there would have been no war. The reason why there was a war is because Israel was not representing the independence of Palestine, but the independence of the Jewish communities of Palestine that were trying to take over a territory that was inhabited by non-Jewish people to ethnically cleanse them and or subject them to second-class status within the borders of the country they were creating. So Arab nations attacked to buffer them, to keep them from going all the way. So uti possidetis makes no sense in that context. It's a weird argument, man. She cannot claim that Israel is the independentist movement of Palestine when her definition of what Israel is the nation state of Jewish people, not of Palestinians. To the point where not even the name was kept. How can Israel be the independent mandate of Palestine when the name Palestine was dropped to incorporate the name Israel, because Israel was the nation state of Jewish people in Palestine? So it's clearly a case of secession, not a case of uti possidetis, and the pre-independence borders argument makes no sense. Okay. And I mean, the argument that this land belongs to Israel then becomes, she's not making a biblical argument, though. She's making a legal argument. I just think she's making a terrible legal argument. But what she's trying to do is she's trying to translate a biblical claim into legal terms in the 21st century. That's what's behind all this.
5 minutes until the next speaker. So on Palestinian recognition and whether they are entitled to a state.
I love how they say we have 5 minutes and then the video lasts 20 more.
Simple yes/no question. Do you believe that the Palestinians are entitled to a state?
Yes.
Self-determination does not give one a right to a state in international law.
That's a no.
But would you like to understand why?
I'd like to know from you whether Natasha Hausdorff believes that the Palestinians have the right to a state.
I have explained that the Palestinians already have self-determination and an autonomy.
Not self-determination.
There is no
Should they have
right.
They cannot have self-determination if they're under a military occupation. I mean, that's very, very, very basic.
Right to a state is not according to international law.
That's a no. Thank you.
Edward, and then I'll go to Richard.
It's funny because people like her argue that Zionism is the belief that Jews should have a right to self-determination, period. Right? They often omit that what they mean is self-determination through a Jewish state that excludes non-Jews, which is the actual full definition of Zionism. And so she's twisting that in the context of Palestine by saying, oh, no, they already have self-determination. Self-determination is not needed through a state, right? Self-determination does not require a state. So the obvious question that emerges is, like, does that apply to Israel as well? Like when the Balfour Declaration said that the Palestine would become the national home for Jewish people, expressing, representing, expressing the desire for Jewish people to have self-determination, didn't that then mean that within Palestine, there could have been a national home for Jewish people that did not require a state, which was actually the position of the British at the time of, like, before the partition plan, that the national home in Israel, if you read the white paper, the UK white paper on Palestine in 1939, they say the Jewish national home in Palestine has already been established. It's just not sovereign. The reason why we're now talking about two states is because Israel seceded, right? So yeah, it's okay.
Sorry, Bruce, I'm interested in the concept that in other places around the world, I'm thinking of places like Kosovo and East Timor, the international community has carved out effectively a new territory or jurisdiction. So if we accept that that is within the purview of...
Well, Kosovo is a tricky case to argue here because technically speaking, under the law of self-determination, and this is just like lex lata, okay, the law as it is, not the laws I would want it to be. Kosovo under international law doesn't really have a right to external self-determination. So when you talk about self-determination, you need to understand it in internal and external. Self-determination is the right to do whatever you want, right, within, as a people within a territory. That can be expressed internally, as in, for example, the way that let's put an example. Native Americans in the United States, well, supposedly, not fully, but should have self-determination within the United States. African Americans should have self-determination within the United States, even if they are like not the majority of the country, right? They should be allowed to do whatever they want. They don't. They aren't, right? And there are violations of self-determination in the United States. But that's the concept. The concept is that if there's a minority group in your country, they also need to have self-determination. They need to be free to do whatever they want. Like the Scottish in the UK, like the Welsh and the Irish in the UK, right? So Kosovo is a tricky thing because, like, for you to say that you have a right to self-determination externally, as in through a state, you need to have been what international law considers a self-determination unit that has a right to self-determination in the external fashion. So usually states, so subnational entities don't have a right to be independent, to have external self-determination. So Bosnia has a right to external self-determination, but say Boston, Massachusetts does not have a right to external self-determination. The only entity that has a right to external self-determination that hasn't been a state before is countries that are subjected to colonial or racial domination through, a big debate on whether remedial secession exists or not. But generally, if you are subjected to colonial domination, you're allowed to declare independence and become a state, even if you weren't a state before. But if you're not subjected to colonialism, anyone else has to have been a state before to be a state later. And so Kosovo, that wasn't a state before, technically shouldn't get the right to external self-determination under international law. So weird example to use here, but let's see where this is going. My internet sucks today.
Or the international community, whatever the medium is for doing that, it is perfectly acceptable. My question is it is perfectly viable within a peace settlement for the international community to establish a Palestinian state within Israel?
Critical and operative.
It's the other way around, my friend. Israel was established in Palestine, not Palestine in Israel.
There is within a settlement. So any agreement between parties will, of course, change the default position of uti possidetis juris. We just haven't had that until now. I'm not advocating as part of a solution, and I know you asked about the solution first and the law second. It might have been helpful maybe if it was the other way around. But I'm not advocating for any particular solution on the basis of the proper application of international law. But the proper application of international law is critical if negotiations are going to have any chance of success, because you cannot negotiate in good faith when both the law and the history are being misrepresented to this extent.
So what the International Court of Justice said is that what Israel is doing in Palestinian territory is unlawful because it affects the right to self-determination of Palestinian people. Right to self-determination is jus cogens. It's a peremptory norm that admits no exceptions. You cannot agree to not comply with the right to self-determination. people under colonial occupation have an immediate right to external self-determination. Immediate right. There's no mandates anymore. There's no, oh, when you're ready, you'll be independent. No. Under the terms of the Jus Cogens right to self-determination, immediately Palestine has to access external self-determination. So if self-determination is Jus Cogens, then the peace process cannot change that. The principle of land for peace, the idea that, oh, we will give you land, and in exchange of that, we will change the borders so that we can keep the settlements. You can keep, some piece of land elsewhere in Israel, empty land, and then we will consider that a good exchange, and that'll give us the argument for peace, because Israel will achieve what it calls strategic depth. It'll become thicker, which is their fear that if there's a war with Jordan, it is very easy to attack Tel Aviv because Israel is very thin. So it's always looking for strategic depth. So it wants the settlements as a way of creating strategic depth in the case of an invasion, which is a very 20th century mindset for a 21st century war. You don't need strategic depth in those circumstances. But in any case, that agreement, that idea that you can agree that there are specific portions of Palestinian territory that will go to Israel doesn't fly with the right to self-determination. So what we have here is two different theories of what creates Palestine and what creates Israel in international law. Natasha Hausdorff says uti possidetis. I say self-determination. The ICJ says self-determination. International law of decolonization says self-determination. So it's weird to see the insistence on uti possidetis, because you cannot agree on different borders when what's at stake is self-determination. This is what we saw with this is what we're discussing with like the Chagos case as well, for example. You cannot just partition Mauritius and remove the Chagos archipelago from them and say, well, you're still being independent in the other parts of Mauritius. We get to keep the Chagos Islands so that we can put a military base there. The ICJ said, no, that's not how self-determination works. You cannot agree around it. And I would go even further and say that the self-determination unit that needed to be recognized there was the Chagosians, not Mauritius as a country. The Chagosians had a right to external self-determination because they were the ones that were under colonial domination. But anyway, I digress. The point being that the basis for states in international law is self-determination. The reason why uti possidetis exists as a principle is because these entities that are subjected to colonial domination have a right to self-determination, and they should be able to keep the borders that they had when they were created by the colonial powers. There's a lot to discuss about the coloniality of uti possidetis. There's not enough time right now. But suffice to say, you cannot agree your way around of applying self-determination because it's Jus Cogens. Uti possidetis is not, by the way.
Richard.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to move on to talk about international humanitarian law and ask you some questions on jus in bello. If we can agree, first of all, there's a consensus that a single fighter suspected of being a terrorist operative for Hamas, Islamic Jihad, is a legitimate target, and a civilian who is not a legitimate target.
Well, but that's an oversimplification, because there are members of Hamas that don't qualify as combatants under international humanitarian law. So some members of Hamas are civilians.
I think we can probably agree on that much. Then what about operatives' homes? Would those be legitimate targets? Terrorists, operatives' homes?
The use of the framework already is affecting the result, right? It's the home of a terrorist. But you haven't determined that the specific individual person is actually directly participating in hostilities or has a continuous combat function to be a valid target. You're just saying, oh, he's a member of Hamas.
Depends ultimately on the purpose that they are being used for. the definition of a military target ultimately depends on its use in the hostilities. So I can tell you.
So this is true. It is true that if you use a private residence as for military purposes, then you can turn that home into a military target. What she's being disingenuous about is that Israel did not target people in their homes because they were being used for military purposes. They targeted these individuals in their homes because it was easier to locate them there than in the battlefield. And so they decided to attack people through this AI software, Where's Daddy, when they were at home, and therefore increased the collateral damage, quote unquote, the disproportionate civilian harm, because they also killed the wife, the partner, the daughter, the son, the grandma that lived there. Right? So she's being disingenuous about this. This is not how Israel targeted homes.
From my time on the ground in Gaza in September, I went in as part of a military expert panel. I could see that civilian houses were booby-trapped.
She went as a military expert, invited by Israel, of course.
At least in Rafah, it seemed that more or less every house or every second house that we were encountering had been booby-trapped by Hamas. And therefore, much of the destruction that one is seeing in terms of the civilian infrastructure is unfortunately as a result of the IDF having to disarm these booby-trapped houses, mostly by destroying them. But in terms of targeting, international humanitarian law is very...
Okay, so the fact that a house is booby-trapped does not mean that the house is a military target. If the house is booby-trapped, it's because, for the house to be a military objective, it would need to be used for military purposes. Booby-trapping it does not mean that you can destroy the house. Right? Because there's an argument for military necessity. Do you really need to destroy the house? If there's nothing happening in the house because you control the area so fully that you are destroying the house through a controlled explosion. And also remember, this is not how Israel has targeted homes.
Very clear that you can only target military targets, that one has to distinguish between civilians and military targets. And certainly the officers that I was on the ground with, very senior officers from 6 NATO states, and we spent a week undertaking briefings with the military, were all convinced that there are no issues vis-a-vis the distinction element of international humanitarian law and Israel's application of it that you've raised.
So, this is false, because if Israel is targeting individuals in their homes when they are not directly participating in hostilities, and they're not distinguishing membership between those who have a permanent, continuous combat function in Hamas and those who are simply members of Hamas, let's say police officers in Hamas or political officers in Hamas, then there is a problem with distinction, because you are targeting the home of a person who is not directly participating in hostilities at the time. Therefore, you're attacking an invalid military target. So, I'm sure that the people that Israel invited to oversee their own military operations would agree, but then that's why you're not supposed to accept these invitations by an army to say, am I doing things right? So that you can rubber stamp it and move on, right?
What about if the building also, let's say there are people in it, there are terrorist operatives and there are civilians. In that instance, would the IDF be...
Under the definition of terrorist, a lot of civilians are still categorized as terrorists. So this division of the civilian and the terrorist under international humanitarian law is very unhelpful.
Entitled to target that building?
That depends on another very important aspect of international humanitarian law, which is the rule of proportionality. Now, it's probably worth taking a moment to explain what it is, because it's perhaps the most misrepresented element of international humanitarian law.
I mean,
it requires...
we've got somebody else who's going to ask about that business about proportionality being about the military objective rather than about it being somehow to do with equivalent deaths on both sides. Of course, that is a very misrepresented principle of international humanitarian law. But I want to focus on distinction. If there are civilians in the building, the IDF targets that building, you've established that might be.
Why is the IDF targeting the building? Why is the military target the building as opposed to the specific area where the military activity is taking place? And you see the problem here. If you have a building, and in that, right now, in this building, right now, my neighbor over there is a Hamas police officer. They're not, but like, you know, and so they don't have a continuous combat function in Hamas. So therefore they are technically civilians, but they are considered terrorists under the definitions that Israel has and that the UK has. And so Israel decides that they want to target my neighbor, right? My neighbor is planning, let's say let's say for sake of argument that he invites a bunch of high-ranking military people to discuss their operations, right? There's like 3 guys there and they're planning how to defend against the IDF. They're medium rank, not, you know, the head honchos, but medium rank officers of, you know, the Al-Qassam brigades. What is the military target? Natasha Hausdorff and this MP here, that I don't know who he is, are saying the military target is the entire apartment complex, all like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 families, and arguably, if you're using a 2,000-pound bomb, then the 2 other building blocks next to me and all the buildings, across the street that will be affected or destroyed, that's the military target. And everyone that lives there is proportionate damage because they're mid-ranking, Hamas officials, right? Because the military target is the building. That premise is in the question. It's weird that's the premise of the question. What is the military target? The military target is the individual that's on the other flat, not the building. Like, why is the building all of a sudden the military target? The building can be a valid military target because it is being used for purposes of planning a military operation, but not the entire structure, just area that's being used. A flat is separable from the building. It's ridiculous to argue that you can destroy an entire apartment complex under any reason. Like, don't get me wrong, there will be circumstances where huge amounts of civilian damage can be legal. Like if you're bombing a factory and you kill the workers, or if, I don't know, it's World War II and Adolf Hitler is in your building, and there's no other way. But like, that's not what's going on.
A violation of the IHL principle of distinction?
You cannot separate the two, I'm afraid. Distinction, proportionality, precaution, and necessity all work together. So if the target in that building is necessary to advance the military objectives of the fighting force, if they have identified terrorist operatives there, then the next 2 factors to consider are the first, which is proportionality. And that is about, as you correctly indicate, weighing up the importance of that military objective against the anticipated civilian collateral damage on the basis of intelligence that is available. That is not an effects-based assessment, that is a intent-based assessment. But the other aspect of this, the 4th principle, which is critical, is precaution. And this is something that Israel does do on a scale, I'm afraid, I have to say, never before seen, because other modern armies aren't in a position to issue the sorts of warnings and the evacuation measures that Israel has.
Parenthesis. Other armies are not able to do this because other armies don't always occupy the area they are bombing for decades. So the argument that Israel isn't occupying Gaza sort of falls flat when Natasha Hausdorff says, oh, but we send text messages to people to get out of their homes in 15 minutes or they'll be exploded. Oh, so you have access to their telephone numbers, huh? Interesting. Why is that? Is it that perhaps Gaza is occupied by Israel?
Taken with respect to this urban armed conflict.
So perhaps we could then take an example. I mean, the sort of precaution that you talk about is the tapping on the roof before ordnance.
Knock on roof is one of the
distinctive elements of this particular conflict. Could we use an example of the destruction of the Al Yarmouk neighbourhood 12-storey residential building in October 2023? The target of the strike was Hamas terrorist tunnel underneath the building. The building was 12 stories tall and it resulted in the death of 81 women and children. Was, in that instance, international humanitarian law applied? Did we see here the principle of distinction used?
You are asking me about one particular incident in the last year and a half, which I'd be very happy to look into. Certainly I would have done if there'd been any advance warning, but off the top of my head, I'm certainly not in a position to say one way or the other. And may I be clear? Neither are any international commentators who purport to give a decided answer on that, and there's a very straightforward reason for it. The only way that a proper analysis of your question can be conducted is if the information that was available to the operatives that undertook that strike in advance of conducting it can be properly assessed. We simply don't know what that is because it is not in the public domain. But I would say that the two entities I'm aware of that Israel has shared elements of sensitive intelligence of this nature with, the UK government and the US government, have consistently said they do not have concerns about Israel's approach to international humanitarian law so far as targeting...
Oh, no.
Okay, before Emily Thornberry goes into this, I hate this argument because, of course, people can evaluate the reasonableness of a claim that you needed to destroy 12 stories of residential apartment complexes under international humanitarian law. And this goes to this is a 19th century standard of the laws of war. Like back in the 19th century, like, yes, armies, and someone, Rasova argued the Chile argument. Yeah, Chile, when it was debating its war with Peru in the 19th century, argued, oh, you cannot fault you cannot second guess the decisions of military commanders, because why would military commanders lie? Why would they want to kill civilians? That makes no sense. Commanders are very noble people. So if you had to, bombard the center of Pisagua in the Peruvian-Chile war, then it's because you had to, because armed people were there. If I can offer evidence that no, there weren't armed people there, it doesn't really matter that I'm not a military commander. Of course you can evaluate the validity of a claim, because it's a legal claim. This is the international humanitarian law, is not the private area of analysis of military lawyers encloistered in this private security machine. That's not how it works anymore. We're not in the 19th century anymore, Natasha. I'm sorry. And it's not enough to say, oh, the UK and the US agree with me, because they don't. Biden himself has said that Netanyahu is killing too many people, and the UK government just recently said that Israel was not complying and then backtracked. So it's not really like that. But anyway, let's see Emily Thornberry have a heart attack.
No.
So
why? No. That's an extraordinary allegation.
May I finish the question? May I finish the answer?
Be careful what you're saying.
I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon. No, I've come here in good faith to answer questions, and from the moment I walked in the room, I've been barracked and told to be quiet when I've been trying to answer questions. I will answer this one with your permission.
Please answer this question accurately,
yes,
and with care.
The UK and the US have consistently said that so far as targeting and proportionality, which is what your question pertains to, there are not concerns There have been other concerns raised on the basis of incorrect information. If we have time to discuss detention and aid, we certainly can. But even the United Kingdom, and I'm afraid the Foreign Secretary has had to walk back some unfortunate remarks in the past. So far as targeting and proportionality is concerned, there have not been concerns raised on the
Why is it, therefore, that Britain is not selling arms to Israel that can be used in Gaza? Is it not on the basis that there is a risk of a breach of humanitarian law?
I might ask this committee to look into that very question, because there is no nexus between the concerns that this government has raised on detention and aid and the arms that have been embargoed. There is a very great concern I have that absent a nexus, because of the absence of concerns on proportionality and targeting, that is not a decision that can in fact be lawful. And it is one that has clearly upended the licensing regulations in this country, which certainly has impacts quite outside of the scope of this committee's inquiry, but that are very significant to the UK's ability to export arms confidently to other countries. So this is what I mean about playing fast and loose with real law. It creates very problematic precedents in other respects, and the decision on the embargo is a deeply, deeply troubling one because of this absence of nexus. It is in fact, the Foreign Office has made it very clear in its advice where it's, in its public statements on this, where its concerns lie. And they are nothing to do with the arms that have been embargoed, which must ultimately be for political reasons rather than legal ones.
I think when you appeared before a parliamentary committee, House of Commons committee, this time last year, the Business and Trade Committee, you were talking at that time, and this was prior to the UK's arms embargo on Israel, when the UK was still supplying arms. At that time, you were having to defend Israel's action around distinction and proportionality. And at the time you did it by way of talking about Hamas figures, for Hamas-run health ministry figures, and was suggesting that they are overinflated, perhaps 1/3 greater than your recognised figures. My question is, does Israel have figures on civilians killed in Gaza?
No, for the very simple reason that it is not targeting civilians. And therefore...
That's not how it works! That's not how it works! The United States has lists of how many civilians it kills in armed conflict. Of course, they argue that they're not targeting civilians. They still register how many they kill, but sheer basic due diligence of applying an international humanitarian law that requires you to not kill civilians disproportionately. This is like, wow!
The Israelis have put out on the terrorists that it knows that it is eliminated, which, if you think about it logically, makes sense because it is targeting these individuals. We do actually address in my written submission to the committee, which I would ask you all to look at, the detail of the problems with the Hamas statistics, which have been repeated deeply carelessly, in my respectful opinion, and that do need to be criticised. I mean, Hamas has also revised them down subsequently, but there are figures, for example,
they
from
weren't
the
revised down.
Hospital strike in October 2023, which have not been revised, even though it's clear now that the hospital was never struck and that, in fact, it was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that fell in the car park of the hospital. Now, that example is in and of itself critical because it indicates that these figures that Hamas have been putting out and the world have been...
Even if that were true, and it isn't, there's no conclusive evidence on this, and it does seem to be that the Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket argument is not correct. But even if it were correct, it doesn't matter. You still destroyed all the hospitals in Gaza. You bombed it to the ground. What are you even talking about? This level of gaslighting. There's no building standing in Gaza, for the love of God. Like, this idea that, oh, we're actually not killing that many people. We have videos and pictures.
Parroting do not make clear distinctions. They do not indicate the difference between combatants and civilians. They do not indicate how the individuals are said to have been killed. And we also know that Hamas have been shooting their own civilians.
They also don't count people that have starved to death, by the way.
And that their rockets fall short in the Gaza Strip. They kill indiscriminately. They do not come with warnings like Israeli strikes. They do not come with a proportionality analysis. So on that basis, I'm afraid, the continued use of these false statistics are deeply problematic. But according to the numbers that Israel has released, even taking a number of those Hamas statistics at face value, the civilian to combatant casualty ratio.
Ah, no, not the
and this
casualty
is
ratio.
setting aside the issues with the inflation of these figures by Hamas, is in the region of 1 to 1 or 1.5 to 1.
How can you know if you don't have civilian numbers? Oh my God. So don't believe the Ministry of Health numbers, but do believe them so that you can construct this 1-to-1 ratio that I just made up. Because like the 1-to-1 ratio is like grab the Hamas grab the Gaza Ministry of Health numbers, subtract from that the military combatants that Israel says it has killed, that it cannot prove that they were combatants, because to prove that they were combatants, they would need to prove that they were not civilians, and they don't have civilian casualty numbers. And so subtract those, then subtract a bunch of made-up numbers like natural deaths and like stuff like that, and then eventually, if you remove enough people, then you see that the amount of combatants and the amount of civilians are in a relationship of 1-to-1. That's not how statistics work. You cannot just grab Israel's numbers and subtract them to the Gaza Ministry of Health numbers. That's just not how it works.
That is remarkable for the sort of urban armed conflict that Israel is grappling with. When one considers the global average that is put out by the United Nations.
The United Nations doesn't have a global average.
With the American health authorities statistics in Iraq and Afghanistan.
The 9-to-1 ratio explored very specific strikes and includes in the victims peoples that were wounded. This is such a bad claim. Why won't it die? You cannot, God, okay. You cannot compare a statistic that incorporates people who survived the attacks with a statistic that doesn't, which is all dead people. And also, it's not comparing every single strike. It's comparing strikes that are very specifically counted, like very specific number of strikes, not all strikes, the most destructive strikes. This is just bad. This is just bad. This is not how it works. That 9-to-1 number is made up. That 1-to-1 number is made up.
Looking at 3-to-1 and 5-to-1. And when one considers that Hamas's modus operandi here is to increase the civilian casualties as much as it can, and plainly to lie about the casualty figures when it cannot, I'm sorry to put it in these terms, but we're short on time, when it cannot secure sufficient numbers of its civilian population and their demise, because that is its main aim here, which is truly tragic for the Palestinians involved. When it cannot do that, it is falsifying the figures. So those are some of the reasons we need to be very, very careful. May I just...
We're running out of time, and I've got two people who still want to ask questions. If you don't mind, can I move on to Afra, and then I'll move to Alex, but we're 5 minutes over already, so...
Thank you. Thanks for the depth of covering your answers. I won't ask about proportionality because I think we've covered that quite fully now. I wanted to move on to talk about the law in relation to Hamas and really thinking through, does international humanitarian law, in your view, adequately address the challenges posed by non-state actors like Hamas in a modern warfare situation where, or is it possible that reforms might be needed to clarify what the obligations and accountability are of those non-state actors?
Well, unfortunately, it does not. It simply works on the basis that armies facing each other in non-asymmetric contexts will apply the laws of armed conflict because there's a mutual benefit to that. And so, frankly, the whole framework of international...
No. That's not it. That's not it. It simply establishes prohibitions on what conduct is not allowed, and it grants those prohibitions to state and non-state actors as equally as it can. It cannot actually do it equally because a non-state actor that participates in a non-international conflict is still subjected to domestic law, whereas the soldiers aren't when they participate in hostilities. So the mere participation in hostilities for a soldier is not a crime, but for a non-state actor it is. And so it's not full equality, but it is international humanitarian law grants establishes prohibitions on behavior. It does not presume that states will comply with it. I don't think any part of international humanitarian law presumes that the parties will comply with it. It just says, because what I am doing is establishing prohibitions for you, if the other person violates, the other group violates the rules, that doesn't mean that you can violate the rules, because there's no direct reciprocity here. If Hamas kills civilians, that doesn't mean that Israel can kill civilians. We established this in Nuremberg, right? That's not how it works. What is your advantage of reprisals that are against human rights? Nothing. If Hamas violates the laws of war, that doesn't give Israel the right to violate the laws of war.
Humanitarian law fails when you have terrorist groups like ISIS, like Hamas, like Hezbollah that are using the laws of war against.
They're not using the laws of war.
Law-abiding moral militaries like the UK and like Israel.
So my argument would be that Hamas has not actually pledged to comply with the laws of war. In my opinion, it should. That's one of the things that I think, they should do what the ANC did in South Africa. They should pledge to comply with the rules of international humanitarian law.
Israel, and in Israel's case, Hamas knows that Israel is upholding a much higher standard of international humanitarian law than any army has in history, and therefore it is using that mechanism and that framework as part of its strategy to survive. Let me be clear, Hamas's main aim here is to survive to see another day. That's why I talk about encouraging Hamas in these circumstances being so diabolical for the Palestinians who are undoubtedly suffering under them in Gaza. So far as reforms are concerned, the difficulty is, of course, that when you are dealing with terrorist groups, you cannot subject them to the standard censor in the international legal arena. Sanctions won't necessarily work, although, when you're dealing with a state terror actor like Iran, they certainly do and ought to be deployed. But so far as Hamas, Hezbollah, or even the Houthis are concerned, unfortunately, it is military action alone that can seek to defeat the terrorist entity, rather than, say, convince them that there is something to be gained for them by complying with international law. So I'm afraid reform wouldn't strike me as particularly conducive to convincing terrorist organizations that they need to amend their ways.
So Geneva Call, the NGO, would disagree. They've done a wonderful, amazing job in getting armed groups to comply with international humanitarian law.
And does that go for example, where we see Hamas leaders and wanting to hold them accountable? Is there any mechanism under international law that they could be held accountable for?
The International Criminal Court, which Israel does not support.
The atrocities.
There is a mechanism under Israeli law, and in fact there are many discussions at the moment of the appropriate means and method of trying the Nukhba terrorists of the 7th of October and those also who've been detained subsequently. The difficulty with an international mechanism is that, frankly, so far as
international law is
Israel
Hamas
is concerned, and I say this trying to put myself in their shoes so much as possible, when one sees, and we come back to this point on the weaponization of international law being upended and abused to such an extent against the only Jewish state, I don't think there can be any confidence that an international court or tribunal can be properly relied upon with respect to any issue where Israel is concerned. And the International Criminal Court is a case in point here. It also has no jurisdiction over the Hamas terrorists, and the single warrant that it issued against a dead man, Mohammed Daif, as some sort of grotesque pretense of holding both sides accountable, which in and of itself seeks to draw an equivalence between the only democracy in the Middle East and a terrorist organisation that's internationally prescribed. When we see even what the International Criminal Court has done, I think it really behoves Israel to treat any international initiative in that regard with some degree of suspicion and perhaps even angst.
Thank you.
Amazing.
May I ask Alex if you could ask the last questions and then we'll move on?
Thank you. So firstly, I I take your claim that the IDF has the highest standards of IHL for any army in history as outrageous. Having particularly served in the British military myself, I think that is a particularly staggering claim. I would like to ask about international humanitarian law again and aid deliveries. So 91% of people in Gaza are facing food insecurity. 1/3 of hospitals there are completely out of action, with the other 2/3 damaged already by the fighting. 92% of housing units have been destroyed or damaged. And there's now 50 days that no aid deliveries have been accepted into Gaza. And in fact, Israeli ministers have declared they are blocking aid, in particular to exert pressure on Hamas. This is, from my opinion, and almost every aid agency in the world, a clear breach of international humanitarian law. I wonder how you think Israel is justifying this.
First of all, with reference to the highest humanitarian standards applied by the IDF, it's not just from me. I think you've had Colonel Richard Kemp, certainly at other parliamentary committees, testifying, John Spencer, the head of urban armed conflict at West Point in America, and there are certainly the members of the military expert panel that I went into Gaza with, who would give very similar testimony. But we'll have to agree to disagree on that. I approach this as an international lawyer looking...
No. You just said that you, as an international lawyer, you cannot evaluate the conduct of militaries because you don't have the information. So, and mind you, neither does John Spencer or Richard Kemp.
Specifically at the application of IHL. So far as the aid issue is concerned, the statistics on this, I'm afraid, have been consistently misrepresented. So far, across the operation period of, this is before the ceasefire, there was 1.1% of trucks that came from the international community to aid crossing points that Israel refused to allow into Gaza. That was it, because they were either dual-use items or because the aid organisation in question didn't allow a search to be conducted. Now, those searches...
It's about the current blockade, not what...
Well, let's be clear, because the reports that you referred to were also erroneous, and in fact many of them predicting famine in Gaza, and that have been used to justify the false accusations of starvation as a weapon of war.
Given how little time we have, I'd greatly appreciate it if you could
this
just
does
answer
require
Alex's
a full
question.
answer.
Answer the question that you've been asked,
but
if you don't mind, given that we are already running over time.
Right.
You've been asked specifically about aid not getting in at the moment, and you're talking about another period of time, which is in itself contentious, and we don't have time to get into that argument. What we're asking, the question that you were asked was very precise and carefully put, and I would greatly appreciate it in the few moments that we have left, if you could answer it.
The question I was asked referenced in reports of international bodies which have erroneously predicted famine and starvation in Gaza. And in fact, I link in our submission to a report separately we have done on those aid reports and on the famine review that we have conducted, which I would...
I will just say, Emily Thornberry defended Keir Starmer's statement that Israel had a right to blockade all aid from Gaza. So, not that awesome.
Ask the committee to consider because the IPC report in particular was called out by the Famine Review Committee as being based on only impartial information and being implausible in its predictions. Now that is significant.
It was implausible because Biden forced Israel to send more aid. So the predictions made before Biden forced Israel to send more aid did not come to fruition.
To answer your question on what aid organisations have reported, those allegations, I'm afraid, are false, and you only need to look at the volume of aid that has gone in.
Are the blockade in place at the moment?
I'll come to that in a moment. If I will. There were several parts to your question. One only has to look at the volume of aid that has gone in, which is publicly available on COGAT statistics on their website, and the subsequent analysis of the calorific content of that aid, which in the 7 months that were analysed, January to July last year, found that over 3,000 calories per person per day had gone into Gaza.
Which is a terrible way of approaching this, because aid is not distributed equally. Just because a number of calories per person per day go in doesn't mean that those calories are reaching every single person, because you are bombing the humanitarian actors that are trying to deliver that aid, like World Central Kitchen and like countless other instances where humanitarian aid workers have been killed by Israel. So it's a terrible statistic. You should send more than the bare minimum people need to survive, under the expectation that your messed up army is going to disrupt supply.
Which is significantly in excess of NHS guidelines. That is the position before going into the ceasefire. As part of the ceasefire, aid was flooded into the Gaza Strip.
Flooded,
so that
sure.
even international humanitarian organisations have agreed that there were many, many months of aid available in the Gaza Strip. So that the subsequent seizure of
it's like we can't see the videos. Like Magic was saying, like a 4-month-old starved to death 2 days ago. It's like they think we cannot see this.
Aid going in as part of an attempt to put pressure on Hamas. Let me be clear. Hamas has been stealing the aid, selling it on the black market, and using those funds to fuel its war machine against Israel. So that is the reason for the aid being turned off, on the basis that the civilian population have sufficient because of the flooding of Gaza with humanitarian aid over the course of the ceasefire. I hope that answers your question.
So your position is, despite the UN's reports that over 90% of people in Gaza face food insecurity last week, it's acceptable to conduct this blockade because there was lots of aid delivered in the past.
So the UN reports, and that's why it's important that I address them, have been consistently found to be wrong. And I ask you to look at the numbers, the data that has gone in, and the analysis of the calorific content. If there are indeed individuals facing food insecurity in Gaza, then there is a very clear reason for that, and that is Hamas's diversion of aid, because the total volume that has been facilitated into the Gaza Strip by Israel is far in excess of what is required by individual Gazans. Hamas has been stealing the aid, but also, I mentioned they were shooting civilians. That includes shooting civilians that were seeking to obtain some of that aid that was being brought in by international organisations. That is the true tragedy here, which in some sense brings us full circle, that if the United Kingdom's policy is to continue, I'm afraid, to encourage Hamas, and Anthony Blinken did actually, in a moment of great honesty, reference America's part in encouraging Hamas. Every time there was criticism of Israel, Hamas would walk away from hostage negotiations. That is, I think, a very important message for this committee to internalise, to include in its report, and to feed back to the government in terms of building a better future for both Israelis and Palestinians alike.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for coming in and for fighting back. Thank you for coming in today. And if there's anything further that you believe that we didn't give you an opportunity to give evidence about, please put it in writing.
Well,
thank you for your time.
I'd be very grateful if the clerk might email me the individual instance that I was being asked about, because despite the answer being we can't tell unless we have the information that we don't have access to, I'd still very happily look into what might be publicly available about it.
Thank you.
Whew, okay, that was a lot. Yeah, so generally, I honestly think at this point it is impossible to defend this. The whole thing. Everything she says, it's impossible to defend it. Like, you cannot fight a war in that in a way where we ignore that Israel is launching 2,000-pound bombs against residential buildings, that Israel is shooting people that have white flags, walking around death areas that they have artificially designated through invisible lines in the sand, that within those kill areas they are shooting kids in the head, that when people need ambulances, including little girls that are in an ambulance talking to an ambulance over the phone, they still shoot at the ambulance, that they find ambulances, shoot at the ambulances, that bury the ambulance in the ground, that they attack their own humanitarian aid providers like World Central Kitchen, that they have a specific plan to starve the population of Gaza so that they will flee and leave Gaza so that they can occupy the land. Like, we are not blind. We can see it, right? And these legalese excuses don't make sense when you start looking at the specific claims. Like, for crying out loud, Israeli hostages without clothes, so they were not hiding anything, shouting for help in Hebrew, were killed by the Israeli army. And there's no distinction problem in the, IDF. They killed Israelis shouting in Hebrew with no clothes on them. They're shooting at everything that moves in this invisible kill zone areas. So these legalese excuses are frankly ineffective when you can see what's going on, and this is why they don't allow the press in. Of course, this is why it's all we need to learn what we learn through brave Palestinian journalists that are then accused of being Hamas and then executed by Israel. Right? It's very transparent. I am deeply unconvinced, as I thought I was from the beginning, and I think, again, all of this is just disingenuous and gaslighting in light of what we know has happened. Just on those specific instances, we know they killed their own hostages. We know they shot at World Central Kitchen. We know they executed Palestinian Red Crescent doctors. We know they killed Hind Rajab. We know there's X-rays with little kids with bullets in their brains. We know that they targeted hospitals over and over again while themselves using hospitals as military bases. We know that they've destroyed universities through controlled explosions with no military necessity. We know all of these things. We know that they've done all of these things. We know that their humanitarian areas are poorly explained, and so people go to areas that they are told are safe and then they're still bombed in them. We know what's going on. And you cannot save that by saying, oh, but if you use an apartment complex for a military objective, then I can destroy the entire apartment complex. Or if there is a tunnel underneath, it doesn't matter how many people I kill. Like, come on.